Waggle and Mrs. Waggle. Mrs. Wiggle lived in a house, and she decided that she would go and visit Mrs. Waggle. So she opened her door, pop, out she came, pop, closed her door, pop, and she went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill. And she knocked on Mrs. Waggle's door. Mrs. Waggle, are you there? It's Mrs. Wiggle. But Mrs. Waggle was in her garden. She was pulling up the carrots for the tea. So Mrs. Wiggle had to go back home. So she went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill, opened her door, pop, in she went, pop, closed the door, pop. The very next day, Mrs. Waggle decided to go and visit Mrs. Wiggle. So she opened her door, pop, out she came, pop, closed the door, pop, and she went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill. And she came to Mrs. Wiggle's house and she knocked on the door. Mrs. Wiggle, are you there? It's Mrs. Waggle. But Mrs. Wiggle was out in her garden. She was hanging up her clothes. So Mrs. Waggle had to go all the way back home. So she went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill, opened her door, pop, in she went, pop, closed the door, pop. The very next day, Mrs. Wiggle decided to go and visit Mrs. Waggle. And Mrs. Waggle decided to go and visit Mrs. Wiggle. So Mrs. Wiggle came out of her house first. Pop! Out she came. Pop! Closed the door. Pop! Mrs. Waggle came out of her house, opened her door. Pop! Out she came. Pop! Closed the door. Pop! And they both came down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill. Hello, Mrs. Wiggle! It's Mrs. Waggle! Hello, Mrs. Waggle! It's Mrs. Wiggle! They were both so pleased to see each other because they had missed each other the other day. Mrs. Waggle said to Mrs. Wiggle, I came to see you, but you weren't in. And Mrs. Wiggle says, oh, I was out hanging my clothes. And Mrs. Wiggle said to Mrs. Waggle, but I came to see you too, and you weren't in. And Mrs. Waggle says, oh, I was pulling out the carrots for my tea in the garden, and I didn't hear you. All of a sudden, the clouds became dark and grey and hung over Mrs. Wiggle and Mrs. Waggle. And soon the rain came down. Oh no, says Mrs. Wiggle, I better go back home to get my washing in. And Mrs. Waggle says, oh, I better go home too and get the carrots for the tea. So they both went down the hill and up the hill and down the hill and up the hill. Mrs. Wiggle got home first. She opened her door, pop, in she went, pop, closed the door, pop. Mrs. Waggle got home next. She opened her door, pop, in she went, pop, closed the door, pop.